Well, welcome to the Science Circle and a happy Darwin Day to each of you. This is the anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species, and as has been tradition for the last about 7 years here at Science Circle, I am nominating someone to be a hero of evolution and give a little bit of a biographical as well as scientific talk to relate to modern day. And like the tradition, I tend to and try to nominate people who have some degree of controversy that are related to their work. And I think this one is probably my most, I think in thinking about it in modern day times, and even more so at his time, quite controversial. So I'm nominating Alfred Kinsey, who introduced really an evolution in sexual thinking. And let's talk about Kinsey. So he was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, 1894, and the first of 3 children. His father was an instructor of shop practice, his mother basically a housewife, and probably maybe not surprising for one of the forerunners of the a new sexual revolution. He was born to very devoutly strict and religious parents and grew up in a very autocratic household. Now, interestingly, his interest in biology says it began in high school. He had a high school biology teacher and and again, this reminds me of Darwin, when we talk about his biography, used to just spend his time in nature, doing stuff, examining things, collecting wildlife. He graduated as valedictorian, and his official class prophecy was to be the second Darwin. In June of 1994, after matriculating at the insistence of his father at the Stevens Institute of Technology, he decided that he really had a passion more for biology, and he transferred to Bowdoin. And again, not mentioned here in the slides, but important biographically, basically cut ties and did this in defiance of his family. And in fact, even though he won a competition to give the college's commencement address, none of his family showed up. He, for graduate school, matriculated at the Bussey Institute at Harvard's Graduate School of Applied Biology, where his interest was kindled by the dean in entomology. And ultimately, he got very specialized in something known as snippids, and that is the majority of his early professional work. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, the specific species of snippids is the gall wasp, an insect that makes its home in oak trees. So something that is very visually around all of us in terms of nature. If you're looking at trees and some of those large galls that form on them, but also relatively understudied in terms of biology. And he graduated in 1919. Now, the key parts of his early profession is that he was appointed assistant professor of entomology at Indiana University in Bloomington. This is in August of 1920. And another major biographical milestone is that he met Clara Bracken Macmillan, whom he married. And ultimately had, I think, 3 or 5 children. What I'm showing here graphically is his major works early on. In 1926, he published an Introduction to Biology textbook. And some of the interesting relevant notes to this textbook is that even though this was in 1926, not every textbook necessarily made a very demonstrative support of Darwinian evolution. And so one of the things that was notable about his was in fact that he, again, very full-throated support of Darwinian evolution. On the right-hand side, he also published his first of 2 parts of his major work on gall wasps, again, characterizing their lifestyle, characterizing the different species, their biography, their geographic distribution. And then he had a follow-up to that, which was a little bit more expansive, a little bit more impressive in terms of the amount of data that he included. He basically described somewhere on the order of 36 completely new species of the gall wasp for that. Now, I mentioned the gall wasp in his early work, and this is something I'll have to admit I didn't even know, but that they don't have this standard way of being generated into a male and female form and then sexually reproducing. What actually happens for them is that they seem to have different alternating forms. That one, there's the gall form, and so that's an aspect of their development. That's where the eggs get laid, they develop. But when they emerge, they actually can be male or female, or actually bisexual. And so this alternation of male and female forms, and also another phase that's bisexual, is I want to point out something that must have spurred Alfred on to thinking about sexuality in a non-binary way. And I'll come back to talk a little bit more about this when we think about the forms of sexuality that we have in nature. But in whatever context, this really was something that developed into what we know Kinsey for more prominently is his work in human sexuality. So again, I want to mention a little bit about the times. And first of all, I do want to credit that a lot of the biographical information is coming from The American Experience, which is a TV show on PBS. And I'm putting that in the local chat here. That's a search on that webpage. So again, a really nice resource for for his life and times. And there's also a video that unfortunately we can't play in Second Life, but I'll pop that up a little bit later. So a little bit about the times, right? In America, in 1873, and was still in force, and in fact is a law that is still on the books, is the Comstock Law, defining contraceptives as obscene material and making it illegal for them to be sent through U.S. mail or transported from state to state. The United States was also the only Western nation to criminalize birth control. And there were interesting Supreme Court cases about that in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Masturbation was held to be sinful, a sickness with the power to erode one's physical health and moral rectitude. Again, I think in the 1950s it ultimately switched to only causing blindness for some reason, but that is, again, not something that was held to be in high esteem as an activity. People were occasionally committed to mental institutions for excessive masturbation, or on oddly rare occasions castrated, thinking that that was something to cure them and ward off the ultimate sickness that would overcome them. Homosexuality was regarded with more than disgust, for sodomy was in most states a felony punishable by imprisonment. Again, this is something where, partly because of Kinsey, during the time of the publication of his major work, a declaration was made by most states that sodomy was not criminal. But in fact, several states did not follow board with that, and it wasn't until 2003 in which the Supreme Court ultimately found sodomy laws to be unconstitutional. So, but again, if you go back in time a little bit more, then this connection to homosexuality, that what they were trying to do was actually criminalize the act of it in order to discourage the overall sexual orientation. Again, but pointing out that that's not a necessarily connection between the two. There was a beginning to sex education in schools. I have that in quotes because what that typically did was try to persuade the young minds on sexual temperance and the hazards of losing control, including the risk of sexually transmitted diseases and out-of-wedlock pregnancies, because the latter again, it's something that goes against the general Christian religious underpinnings of the country at the time. Although, let's face it, abstinence-only sex education is making a comeback. So interestingly, how this connected to Kinsey was that in response to actual student requests, again, so there was this awakening of sex education as a topic. Kinsey, seeing this opportunity, decided to actually develop a marriage course. And interestingly, this ends up becoming the gateway to where he can start collecting data for his ultimate magnus opus. One thing he asked the students to do was to fill out a questionnaire. And so basically starting to gather that, then also having research assistants who were able to do that. One thing pointed out by the documentarians is that, when you can talk about sex education being, this is how you put a condom on a banana, this is where these parts go, this is how sperm and egg do things. But I think somewhat contrary to the times, Kinsey was very interested in what are the attitudes towards sex. What is a healthy attitude so that people are making wise decisions about whether to engage in sex, not have it be a matter of trying to scare them. And I think that this is something that was very much ahead of his times within the context of these classes. Now again, this started becoming an official grant-supported, moneyed research endeavor starting after this class, that he switched from questionnaires to interviews, starting getting more research assistants, and actually a very extensive and complicated, almost a pathway of questions that would occur depending on what various answers were at various times. And so he had to have highly trained assistants in order to do those interviews. One thing to just mention is that this ended up being a lot of travel for Kinsey. And I just want to make one quick mention of this, is that Kinsey, I think, in terms of these interviews and whatnot, started doing what we would definitely consider an inappropriate conduct in terms of a researcher these days, is that these things went into actual sexual practice for him, is that these became opportunities for him to explore, I think in many ways, a highly repressed sexuality. And this is where he started having sexual encounters with men, even though, again, he had grown up with a heterosexual mindset, was married much earlier. And so, again, I don't want to, and we could have a long conversation about some of the other things that he also encouraged his assistants and other people to do in terms of the interview process, and that's a very valid criticism in many cases, but we're going to focus on the actual research. So a couple things happened a decade later. One, the University of Indiana officially established the Institute for Sex Research in 1947. And then a year later, the book Sexual Behavior in the Human Male was published. And so these two major biographical occurrences really do, in the times, again, if you think about post-World War II, social changes happening, a lot of economic changes happening, new conversations about lots of things, and a movement away from taboo, as well as an enhanced amount of educational opportunities for people. This was basically something occurring at the right place, at the right time, to really have a marked influence and impact on what happened. So, but I am right now going to choose to digress to make sure I connect this into the biological aspects of why this is a Darwin Day talk. And so, sex. The key thing biologically about sexual reproduction is that it changes the phases and the development cycles of the organism in a way. That there's basically a body, a soma, and this can be a single-celled organism, multicellular organism, and then there's a production of something known as gametes. And that you go from a diploid state to make haploid gametes, although in some cases the haploid form of the body is the one that we actually are most familiar with. And then, but what's important about the haploids is that they each have half the amount of genetic content that when they fuse back together, you're now back to a diploid organism and things happen. And so this is really the key element of this. And now you look at this and think, this is kind of wasteful. Like, for example, why do we have basically only half of, again, when you think about certain organisms, only half of them are capable of reproduction. Or even if they are like one organism that can do both parts of this, both types of gametes, it's just a lot of extra organ parts. But the important contextual thing to realize about sex is that it produces recombined genetics. And so, again, if you had a bunch of organisms within a species that aren't interacting and changing their genes and interchanging them, then if you have a special mutation that allows some to survive, then they can't pass that on to and combine it with genes from other individuals in the species that also have beneficial genes to pass on and help survive. So ultimately, it's very clear that sexual reproduction is a key part of survival for species because of this genetic mixing and matching and stirring of the pot in order to select out the best. Well, Sumo asked a question, which is, sex makes evolution possible, and that's not a strict way of putting it. But what it does is it gives you opportunities for more variation. And when you have a population that's more variable, if there's some sort of selective pressure, then the opportunity for those to survive actually become better. Even though in many ways, as a workflow process, it can be very resource intensive. Yeah, in some ways it helps with the adaptation, is another way of putting it. And Astor is correct. So, but this is the interesting thing. When we talk about sex, when we look at this picture, we definitely get very focused on thinking about how humans do this, right? And what I have listed here on the right-hand side are a couple examples where this idea of this male to female allogamy, and again, allogamy means the exchange of gametes between different individuals within a species as compared to autogamy. And so that's actually, some things I've listed here is that there are examples where you can actually have an organism that produces basically gametes that don't even look different. They're not male versus female. Like in yeast, we call them alpha versus mating type A, and those can actually recombine and make the diploid. There are hermaphrodites, and in fact, hermaphrodites can engage in autogamy. In other words, they basically can. Well, let's take the example of many flowers. Flowers can self-pollinate, although in lots of cases, flowers try and restrict self-pollination and only cross-pollinate. Sometimes they can do both. And then then there's also sequential hermaphroditism, which is something that I think includes the gall wasp. And there are these crazy things that happen with organisms, is you can have an individual that starts out as male, or protandry, and then actually changes to become a female, or the reverse, protogyny. And in some cases, this can go back and forth either way. It can actually be the actual individual changes sex. And then one thing that's also, you might have heard about this a little bit here and there in the news, is parthenogenesis. Again, the idea that, if you're a goddess, you can sprout out of the head of another god, that you're basically coming into being. But parthenogenesis in the biological sense means that you're producing gametes that through some sort of mechanism can develop into a whole new full individual. And so in parthenogenesis actually are examples of lizards that exist on islands that are just all female, and they don't interact, they don't mate, they don't get involved in sex, but they produce eggs that can become their own individuals. And so what's interesting is that when you look at all these different cases where you're not obligated to male-female allogamy, in some cases they can switch back and forth. In some cases they're stuck, say, being parthenotes. And a lot of this has to do with the life history of the organism and the reasons for why this happens. But in many cases, in some cases, you have the best of both worlds. If you need to just reproduce yourselves, you can do so without having sex. And then in some cases, you then help mix up the gene pool in order to have that variability within the germ line. And so, yeah, and this is something that, again, to point out, does really work on this generational time scale, right? That, again, when you think about invasive species, you can see an invasive species that just rapidly proliferates because it's not engaging in sex. But in terms of a long-term, generational, centuries, millennia type of time scale, that may or may not be beneficial. Now, of course, the other part that develops out of this, and let's come back to thinking about these higher level organisms such as ourselves, is that in these life histories, you can develop what's called sexual dimorphism. And that is the one form of gamete producing individual looks and behaves and has a developmental plan and physicality that's separate than the other gamete producing form of the organism. So I'm showing ducks at the top. And again, not only do these ducks look different, they behave differently. And in fact, the coloration of the male duck is an important part of the mating game. Another one of my favorite examples, of course, is spiders. Several species of spiders. The female is the larger form of the organism, and the male is much smaller. And in many cases, and Aster is going to love this one, the female just eats the male after copulation. Although, again, this is something done to the advantage of the male sperm, because then the female is satisfied and not necessarily having sex with more males. And then the lower left-hand corner showing, I think, the most obvious and readily example of this is male versus female. And again, not only are male and females different, males are bigger. This has led to lifestyle changes that occur that men have traditionally in nomadic society way back when were the hunters, the women were the gatherers. The amount of energy put into the reproductive cycle for women is much, much higher. And one thing that you can see is that the physiology is different. I'm showing a comparative contrast of the pelvis for the male versus the female. The female on the right, it's clearly much more enlarged, so that ultimately a very important part of reproduction for humans is the passage of the head for the offspring. And so, and in fact, it's very true that what's happened in society is that men have, again, probably as an aspect, again, I don't know, but as an aspect of being the stronger sex, have been the ones engaged in typically more often the professions, or in some very strict societies, women stay at home. And the idea there is that they're staying at home to make sure that they're capable and safe and able to reproduce offspring, but then also do most of the child rearing. And so the men need to have, the bigger wallets. Now, so sexual dimorphism is the result of sexual determination systems. And I'm showing a small scattering of stuff here. Again, a lot of this is derived from Wikipedia. Very nice explanations of much of this. But that there are differences in genes, in some cases the whole morphology of the chromosomes that are a part of how that sets off the programming that leads to the sexual dimorphism. What's known in humans is that the Y chromosome has a sexual determinant, the SRY region, that sets off a cascade of hormones that occur, I think, about 8 weeks after conception, that leads to all these morphological hormone changes that are important for the development of the male body and male hormone program and all these things that actually change the complete morphology, change in many ways the morphology of male versus females. This is not the only way of doing it in terms of sex determination. There's what's known as the WZ system in birds. In fact, in a lot of insects, there's this haploid phase. You can have either X, XY, or XO, meaning that the whole organism, in fact, is a haploid. That's how drones are made for bees and whatnot. And in fact, I'm showing a thermometer here on the right that sex determination for some for some species, again, notably crocodiles, I think it is, and alligators, the sex development of the egg is actually influenced by the temperature, right? So there are lots of ways of accomplishing this. In many cases, you find that there is a 50-50, 1-to-1 ratio of those, but that's not always the case. Like you go back and think about bees, there's one queen. The majority of the work is done by female workers, and then you have a smattering of drones around whose only role is for reproduction. So again, life histories make a big influence on sexual dimorphism and the survival of species and what adapts over time. And that can also influence, as we think about higher order organisms that have societies, that have colonies, that can influence what we would call behavior. All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of sexual behavior in the human male. And this slide showing a little bit and introducing the demographics of the study. These dots on this map of the USA shows basically the populations. Again, you'll see a heavy bias towards Indiana, right? And a modern day demographer, statistician would really not be per se pleased with this distribution of people. But you have to remember that given the time, you don't have as easy travel, you don't have online questionnaires, you don't have as much research money to do all these things. And so in retrospect, a somewhat biased population, but again, corrected for as much as possible based on known demographics. And like he says, and I have this excerpt from the book, that, he is including various groups like single, married, previously mailed, various educational levels, various geographic, if not all origins, urban versus rural versus mixed backgrounds, a variety of religious groups. Again, another thing to keep in mind is that there's what's known as a volunteer bias. This was a taboo subject, something that people would be uncomfortable talking about and having maybe their information get leaked. And so there's going to be that bias as well. And of course, there's a heavily dependence on college students. Again, another study where college students are the most well characterized. Now, again, I think at the time, this was considered reasonable, acceptable. I think some of the statistics that have come out over time, one thing that was a result of this, you might have heard that 10% of male adults are gay or homosexual in the United States. And that was likely one of those slight exaggerations, but that's being quoted from these data, and I think modern demographers say that what we strictly call a homosexual male is more in the 1 or 2% at best. Also the 30%, well, I'll come back to that later. All right, so a little bit about some examples of the data, and this is how there are lots and lots of these charts, which is looking at the percent of people over an x-axis. In this case, the x-axis is the frequency of sex for the male. And again, this is divided into, say, younger 30 men, 30 and under, to just all aggregate ages. And so, again, one thing that's kind of an obvious thing that I think we all know about is that younger people tend to have more sex than older people in terms of the frequency. Part of that is just part of our biology. Again, our biology is really geared toward, again, from probably largely derived from our very short lifespans in our earlier history. A lot of sexual activity needs to happen early. Now, the term sexual outlet can refer to any number of things. Heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, petting to climax. I didn't read the full description of petting to climax, but it's the word used over and over, as well as masturbation, oral sex. These are all the things that total sexual outlet means. Whereas intercourse would actually mean between individuals. If you read through the book, there's a lot of demographic, age, education, stratification. Not the point of today's talk, but something that I think is very interesting. Something that, again, you could probably find better, more modern, well-corrected tables and data for anyway. But again, this was something that had not been done in a widespread research manner. There were just, up to this point, no large-scale studies of human sexual behavior. Here's another example of the stratification of looking at married versus post-marital. Again, either divorce or being widowed or being a widower, and then single. And so, again, and looking at relation to what age you are. And so, again, frequency of sex per week, median frequencies among the different age groups stratified by marital status. Again, I think back in those days, there was, because of the morals of the time, an advantage to being married that you had more sex. Now, here's one of the graphs of specifically referring to extramarital sex. And so, again, now this is stratified. You can be single and have extramarital sex. You can be postmarital and have extramarital sex. And these are, but in terms of what we would now refer to as the frequency of affairs, you're looking at that there is a significant amount of sex happening across age groups, actually increasing a little bit near the end for people who were of married status. So again, this is one of these things that was contradicting something kind of contradicting the way people kind of conceptualized what marriage was and was about, at least from the public facing of it. So Emlock mentioned single males above 50 stop altogether. Again, the demographics of the studied population basically ended at the age of 60, right? This was in the data collected in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and so the age range of people that, again, you would also consider to be sexually active was largely limited to good numbers for up to that age bracket. Here's another one that was a bit of a surprising piece of data at the time, and that is the exposure of the fact that people are having homosexual sex. And this was something that was occurring both for people who were married, for people who were post-marital, and again, that's the one where you definitely see a bit of a hump going on there, where there's a sudden increase and then maybe a decrease. And then for single men, and again, this idea that that this is something that's increasing the frequency for men as you're getting to this middle 30s age, it's something that's distinctly different than the frequency he was finding at the age of 20. And so again, this was something that people that, if you're not willing to actually discuss it, is something that's just swept under the rug in terms of a sexual and lifestyle of people. Now, what's interesting, again, let's come back to this one little point, though. This is people who are married who probably are identified by others as being heterosexual are having homosexual sex. All right, so this next one is one of those big summary graphs from the book that's breaking down as a frequency of sexual interactions. Again, not a frequency of time or frequency, but just among sexual interactions, what is the source of that interaction? Again, divided by age group. And so what you can see here is that certainly you start out with a large percentage being none, but then the sources of it go increase in time from marital, also increase in terms of extramarital. And then there's this pretty consistent population of intercourse with prostitutes, and then premarital intercourse with companions. And so that's something that is distinguished over time as well, too. And so, again, the majority of sex that is occurring is marital intercourse once you're in those mid-30s in terms of, we know the frequency of it, but this is giving exposure to the fact that there are other things going on, especially within those married couples. So I think that that is one of those big bottom line things that was interesting for people. Here's another interesting aspect of it. Again, this is source of orgasm. Again, I'm only showing the graph for college educated, but again, divided by age, where the the source of the orgasm, again, a very heavy bias towards masturbation in the adolescent and young ages, which goes down again, I think kind of portraying the idea that there are advantages of marriage. Intercourse with prostitutes, of course, is again that little block of small but consistent among different age groups. And then a fairly increase in the frequency from homosexual outlets. Again, I will mention that the very top, it's a very sliver of a line that is interactions with animals. And again, the summary data for that was that there were maybe 8 million men would be the estimate out of the whole total population that had interactions with animals. So there's a perhaps relevant joke by Louis C.K., a bit by him, that might explain why it's the 10 to, or the 16 to 20 that relates to that. And Emlock points out maybe this is why, good point, why pets are often not allowed in colleges. So really one of the major legacies, and the one that's most familiar with to people, and kind of like the bottom line thing that was advertised, is something called the Kinsey scale. And what he was doing here was, again, perhaps based on his experience with gall wasps and doing lots of, writing biology textbooks, is understanding that even though we have this sexual dichotomy in terms of producers of sperm versus producers of eggs, that is not the whole story of the life history of the human organism. And so you can have a scale from 0 to 6, so again, 7 categories, where you are exclusively heterosexual at 0 and exclusively homosexual at 6. And that within that, there actually is definitionally different percentages of homosexuality from low to high, going left to right. And that, again, when he breaks out these numbers, that when you think about, and again, the x-axis here, or the y-axis here is percent of total population, and then the x-axis is in a given year, what would be the Kinsey scale for sexual interactions among males. And that, again, the vast majority would be considered heterosexual only, but that as you scale from 1, including all 1 through 6, all the way down until finally only 6, that you do have this significant percentage of these ratings that are occurring in kind of any given year. Again, this is not a cumulative average. This is a snapshot in time of sexual activity within a year. So we can pause here real quickly. Any questions or anything people want to talk about with the human male? I'm going to talk about sexual behavior in the human female next, and then close up. Dee makes a point of saying gay groups have, for some odd reason, pushed towards black and white view. The 5 middle categories do not exist. I'm not. I think in some media situations there are people who want to say you're either gay or you're not, but I do think that among a lot of demographers, we actually have lots and lots of categories of sexuality now, and so I think the push. And again, if you look at Second Life profiles, for example, there's lots of terms of sexuality that that you actually see. So I agree that there are aspects of this, at least that I've seen here in America, but I also think that there's the idea that there's a bisexual spectrum is also a well-promoted topic, even among gay groups. But not that I'm a frequent subscriber to, say, gay newsletters or anything. All right. Well, with that, okay, let's move on. Oh, okay. Actually, so you're talking about a very specific phenomenon where, yeah, so there definitely is it does seem to be a bit of a derogatory feeling among lesbians or gay men, specifically to people who identify as bisexual, that somehow there's not some sort of purity of sexuality that you are otherwise expecting. And so, yeah, no, definitely that is something that does occur. I don't know the extent or the degree of it or what certain gay communities do or don't think. I definitely do think that in general, when you think about the LGBTQ plus community, the rainbow flag, there does this tendency to try and be as inclusive as different versions of the sexuality as possible. But you are correct that there are definitely groups of people that identify as lesbian, identify as strictly homosexual men that look down upon bisexuality. Okay, let's talk about sexual behavior. But good question, good point. Again, Kinsey, I think, in many ways, is just trying to portray and categorize data in a way that makes sense to what his interview questionnaire experience was. And again, one thing to keep in mind, too, for him personally, is that he was brought up in a very strict Christian background. He got married, and then what he was probably discovering as he was in his, basically his later years, this burgeoning sense of something different from that upbringing and societal convention, which he unfortunately also explored while he was doing the research. All right. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. So, Sexual Behavior in Human Female was the follow-up book that was published in 1953. Again, the data collection, and you can kind of see that from the demographics, was done in concurrence with the book on the male. Again, this was also published to a wide amount of fanfare. Again, one thing that was actually interesting is that the original male behavior book had a very small print run. It wasn't expected to really be a big bestseller. And then ultimately, it had to get republished many times, and it sold something like 13 million copies since its publication. So again, applying the Kinsey scale to the female population in this case, saw something very similar, that in terms of a snapshot in time, that the active incidence of sexuality and homosexuality and among the scale for women was something that you see as a very similar type of proportion of demographics that you saw for the men. Something that also Kinsey didn't exactly portray, but was ultimately kind of incorporated in later ideas, is that the whole idea that some people, and to include in these population demographics, that there are people who are basically asexual and not engaging or interested in sex per se. So some of these demographic charts would be a little bit different because he was not per se incorporating that sexuality. Although you'll see on the left, he did incorporate the idea that there are people who are just not engaged in sex at the moment. And then, again, similar for men, there was this distribution and exposure. Again, I'm showing a chart here, which is the cumulative incidence of women having extramarital coitus. So again, these are women that are categorized as married at the time that they're engaged in extramarital coitus. And so again, this is a number you might have heard sometimes, that 30% of married women are having sex outside of marriage. That'd be a very pat way of describing this. And again, you'll notice that this is approaching that number, and this is where people were citing that information at the time. It just became a part of the number that sticks in people's head as a part of the popular discourse. So impact. I actually went to Encyclopedia Britannica because as I was doing this research, they had a very good article on Kinsey that linked out to this one. And there's so many words here, right? I think one thing I want to point out, there's so many words here that at the time, the dictionary definition of human sexuality would not have been this. That sexuality encompasses a spectrum. Again, the idea that there's a spectrum is something that you would not expect and was not common at the time. That include attraction, physical intimacy, romantic attraction, and again, part of this is not necessarily what's happening with physical intimacy. And that there are different forms of sexuality for humans that can include heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, again, being attracted to both males and females. Again, there are terms now that did not exist at the time of pansexuality, an attraction that's not really related or limited to gender identity. And then even this idea that there are people who are asexual, just not interested, do not feel these sexual attractions. Some interesting subdivisions there, ones that I've not heard of, were scoliosexuality, which is a specific attraction to transgender or non-binary individuals. Pansexuality, which is these attractions regardless of sex or gender identity. That, again, you're kind of beyond the idea of sexual attraction being limited to just physical body types. Polysexuality, again, somewhat similar to bisexuality, but just, again, kind of not being locked into very specific ideas. Now, interestingly, I had to go to Merriam-Webster. Encyclopedia Britannica did not include this as a separate sexuality type, but sapiosexual, which I will admit is a term that I came across in Second Life profiles. That is relating to or characterized by sexual or romantic attraction, specifically to highly intelligent people, right? So this is, right, regardless of what the person's physical being is, that somehow you're attracted to a very abstract, although in many ways very definable characteristic of a person that's not physical at all. So I think that's, these ideas are all things that are outgrowths of out there. Dee mentions that maybe sapio is a hipster word for bisexuals who want to avoid the earlier mentioned stigma. Yeah, maybe, possibly. Yeah, so this is a very new way of thinking. And again, if I could time travel, it would be really interesting to go back in time and try and document and understand how different things were at the time. But I think we have to attribute some of this to the pioneering work of Kinsey breaking the norm and actually engaging in this research that was unprecedented at the time. And in fact, I think if we continue thinking about this impact, and again, I'm taking this from the Sexual Revolution Wikipedia page, is the whole sexual revolution, again, something that is the 1950s, post-World War II, early 1970s, is a real dramatic shift in Europe and the United States for thinking about what are gender roles, what are the roles of people, what are the opportunities and rights of people in terms of engaging in sex in a sub-context of larger things happening in society economically. So, some of the other things that occurred, just this general idea of accepting homosexuals as people that aren't just inherently sinful, which is, I think, a big step forward. Yeah, there are a couple movies about Kinsey. Actually, now that you mention it, that's a good time for me to put in. There's a YouTube video that was from American Experience. That's a documentary. I was hoping to show it, but it's restricted here in Second Life in terms of a YouTube screen video. And then there's a Liam Neeson movie that was put up by Hollywood in 2002, 2003 that I would love to see. But coming back to sexual revolution, again, legalization of the pill, and again, a lack of enforcement of the Comstock law allowed for, again, a dramatic change in the control women have over their bodies to not get pregnant, which, again, is a very different perspective than what was the traditional American feeling at the time. Legalization of abortion, of course, is another one. Again, it's no longer, within the law, up until a couple years ago, was considered legal. Again, there are definitely forces in America still today, in a modern day America, that would prefer that we go back to a time that's prior to these types of revolutionary thoughts. And so, again, I want to just very briefly connect this back to Darwin Day, that what's really important here to recognize about this work is that when we think about formalized constructs of sexual selection according to Darwin, again, remember, Darwin wrote a follow-up book on the origin of species called The Descent of Man. in which he laid out more of his case for something known as sexual selection, how the mating game determines the features and characteristics that we do and don't see in various species. Again, I mentioned the mallard, humans, spiders. Sexual selection is something somewhat independent of what we consider the survival for the fittest from that classical competitive sense. Again, it's a competition within a species in order to pass your genes on. And so within these constructs of what's necessary for evolution, what's necessary to make gametes and to pass on and make the next generation, within higher organized species that are organized in societies and groupings, there can be lots of other things at play to what actually can happen, and understanding that human condition, or understanding that organism's condition in a way that is independent of what's necessary for survival and reproduction. And of course, the idea that something that is sapient, something that has the ability to think and be intelligent, that these are, again, dramatically different ways of thinking about how we behave and what actually happens. So with that, I would like to declare the hero of evolution for 2025 is Alfred Kinsey. And I'm going to leave us here with a quote from the Indiana University Queer Philanthropy Circle. They designated him as a distinguished member for his significant contributions to the LGBTQ plus community. He was recognized as one of the most influential figures of the 20th century for his landmark research into human sexuality that challenged traditional beliefs and myths. His research concluded that one's sexuality is complex and diverse, and established the groundwork for the gay rights movement. And this was announced in 2021. So with that, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to kind of answer and have a discussion or any questions. And happy Darwin Day.